You are now tuned into the Hip Hop Learners Podcast, a place for conversations on hip hop literature, both scholarly as well as general audience. Today's guest is none other than Dan Charnas. If you're an avid reader of the genre, you're probably familiar with his 2010 publication titled The Big Payback, The History of the Business of Hip Hop. In addition to The Big Payback, though, Charnas has been one of the pioneering voices in hip hop journalism. He worked for The Source in the early infancy stages of the magazine and later became an A&R for Rick Rubin's Deaf American venture in the 1990s, in which he helped shape the career of artists like Sir Mixalot, Chino and Kwest the Mad Lad. Additionally, he's written for The Washington Post, The Financial Times, The Chicago Tribune, Complex, Village Voice, Spin, and many more. In 2016, Charnas co-created the VH1 movie The Breaks, which was later adapted into a television series under the same name. Charnas now teaches at NYU and Columbia and is working on a new book on the life of J-Dilla titled Dilla Time. So this podcast speaks on his 2010 book, The Big Payback. Recently, the book saw its 10-year anniversary, and it's honestly one of the best pieces of hip-hop literature I've gotten a chance to read. We talk a bit about the upcoming work on Dilla as well. However, for those that read The Big Payback, I think this conversation will serve as a nice kind of behind-the-scenes look at the creation process. That said, enjoy the conversation, and please welcome Dan Charnas. Just to kind of start things off, and I know I said this at the beginning of the call, but thank you so much, man, for taking the time out to speak to me here today. I appreciate it. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Very much welcome. Very much welcome. Looking forward to it myself. Thank you.
Yeah. So first off, man, congratulations on the 10-year anniversary of the Big Payback. I'm sure you end up getting this a lot, but it's one of the best hip hop histories that has been written. And on behalf of those that have read it, I just want to say thank you once again for the text. It's an important piece of work, and I think it needs to be written. And yeah, congratulations on the 10 years and the success that it's had so far.
Thank you very much. Well, you know, when you're writing this kind of thing and you're sitting alone in a library, you know, hours and nights on end, it's hard to imagine this moment, right? You know,
yeah.
10 years later, people having read it, people liking it. So yeah, man, I certainly never get tired of hearing that the book resonates with folks.
Yeah, 100%. So I wanted to start by asking about, I guess, the journey that led up to writing this book. So you've been involved in the industry over a number of years and have written on hip hop in various forms, but why take on this project initially? Like, I'm writing a book myself, and it's in no way an easy task. What made you decide to take on this effort and this task, considering you had other ventures in your life?
That's a good question. I mean, you know, I think it was in one sense a way to process what I had been through, right? It was around in the year like 2004 when I really began to conceive of this idea, you know, a business history of hip hop as a book. And I had spent, you know, the last decade, more than 15 years in the music business, specifically in the hip hop business. And, you know, I originally got into it to be a promoter and producer, you know, an A&R, to help hip hop attain everything that it could. And part of that attainment is not just commercial, but creative, you know.
Yeah.
Which is why I was attracted to certain artists I was attracted to, like Kerry Chandler and Chino, like Kwest the Mad Lad. Just really super creative, different, sometimes political, sometimes explicitly political, sometimes implicitly so. And in many ways, even though I was, I don't know, in some ways very much, I had broad experiences in the music business, and I did, you know, work obviously with Sir Mixalot and had some hits in that regard. I did not look back on my career and feel like it was successful. I didn't feel like I had contributed personally anything of worth. I mean, I'm sure that, like, you know, Kwest the Mad Lad might disagree with that, because obviously in signing him, he had a career, and, you know, I don't mean to denigrate like the people around me. I just felt like I hadn't made a contribution. I really hadn't found my place. And I wondered even at that point, was it worth it? Like, did hip hop turn out to be this great thing that, many of us thought it would be, back in the early days when I was writing for The Source and working in the mail profile records like this? Could this change American history? Could this create, that multiracial meritocracy, that, a few of us wanted to see? And I guess, because I felt some kind of way about my own legacy, I knew that there were things that I did that did make me feel like I was good at. Like, I didn't feel like I was good at A&R, but I felt like I was a good writer, and I hadn't written in a while.
That's fair.
And so I started to think about, how do I take what all of this was and turn it into a narrative? And I think the last ingredient of that was seeing Jeff Chang do it
Can't Stop,
Won't Stop
yeah.
in the cultural sense. So his was a cultural history. He called it a history of the hip hop generation.
Yeah.
And, for better or for worse, it was missing certain pieces that related directly to actually how this music got made and popularized, which was that didn't necessarily fascinate Jeff, but it fascinated me. It's like, oh, yeah, here's a story that I can tell. And I remember I had this old idea for a magazine article called, what did I call it? Last Night a DJ Saved My Business. It was about, these sort of young white record entrepreneurs from the outer boroughs who all started disco companies in the early 1980s when disco was crashing.
Yeah.
And so, rap fell into their laps and saved their asses. And well, that's just one part of the story. What about the very beginnings of this business? What about the first entrepreneurs? Who was the first person to make money doing this kind of thing? Who was the first person to open up a business that catered to this audience? That's the story of Sal Abatello, who was the first person to really think that they could make records doing this. And it wasn't just Sylvia Robinson. It was, other folks. Paul, why am I blanking? Became having a senior moment as an author. Paul Winley. Who were the first journalists to write about this stuff? Who was the first person to have a broad vision of this culture? To have Five Freddy, right? What was the first record company by and for hip hop fans that really lasted? That's Def Jam. And then on and on and on, it's basically a catalog of the firsts in the business that set the template for everything else.
Yeah, fair enough.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, early in the book you end up...
So that's why. That's kind of why I did it.
Yeah, early in the book you end up claiming that your motto writing the book was everybody gets to be human. And I think that sentiment is important when we look at your writing, because your characters, which are real people in every instance, are written almost novel-like. Now, I've done interviews with artists and people involved in the business, and I've attempted to write their stories, but it's incredibly hard to write nonfiction, I guess, in this way. I wanted to ask, when you were constructing this and writing this, how much liberty is taken when constructing a narrative like this? It feels almost impossible that this level of description was gathered just from primary sources and interviews. But the way that you end up building it makes it incredibly engaging. I think it's important that it was structured this way because people actually give a fuck about business of hip hop, which maybe on the surface level doesn't necessarily scream interesting or engaging or intriguing, but it is, and I think it needed this kind of this novel-like narrative in order to make that the case. But when doing so, at least from my experience, I found that to be an incredibly difficult process. How much liberty was actually taken when you're doing taking it from the interview to the page?
Zero liberty. You have to root everything. I mean, as a journalist, right?
Sure.
You have to root everything in reporting. And I was lucky enough to have mentors mid-career who kind of showed me the way. This book would not have been possible without my professors at the Columbia Journalism School, where I got my master's in 2007. I got my master's. But Kim Nauer, showing me how to report a beat. I've been reporting. I've been a music journalist for decades before that, but I'd never received that kind of formal training. And then Sam Friedman had a class called book writing, and I crafted the very first chapters and the proposal for this book in that class. And Sam Friedman has this sort of famous lecture about reporting from the outside and reporting from the inside. And as I recall, what he meant by that was, how do you do research and reporting to set up the milieu of a place? If you're going to be reporting about a protest that happens in a building somewhere, go to the building, look at it. What does the curb look like? What do the walls look like? What's your mise en scène? And then reporting from the inside, reporting from behind your character's eyes, talking to them. What did you do? What did you feel? What did you smell? What did you think? What happened next? All of the stuff in the Big Payback is from that. And if I didn't speak to the person themselves, luckily if they were characters in there, I had enough source material that had been gathered from other reporting, done previous to the Big Payback, that I felt I could construct a narrative that was true, to the person's feelings, to their motivations, to the scene. And so that's how I was able to do it. And you're right, it's not easy. But it is, I think it's much more pleasurable and ultimately much more fruitful to write and read about history as a succession of real stories and then a meta story and synthesize all those things together in a story than a frickin' magazine article that's 400 pages in length. I hate that shit.
Yeah.
I hate quotes from people, in quotes, like, that was a really rough time, so-and-so said. Like, no, I want to be in the rough time with them. I don't want a quote from them about that was a really rough time. And that's just the way that I've decided to write.
Yeah, I love the effort in terms of going to the locations and capturing those details and getting those details and, as you say, kind of being in that story and living that story to some degree, even if it's from the outside, to try to insert yourself into there in order to, capture these vivid details in a way that's not expressed explicitly in the interview itself.
When Keith Nathalie told me the story of him being bused to a school in a black neighborhood in San Francisco, and that was a formative experience for him, I went to the school. It's 30 years later, 40 years later, something like that. But I wanted to see if number one, if the building was still there, what did it look like?
Yeah.
Just anything, right? That's going to inform the writing.
And you were living in New York at this period of time as well, right? While you're writing the book? Because, I wanted to ask.
Yeah, I was.
Okay, because I wanted to ask, for those that have read the book, there's a clear focus on the United States. So I think it makes sense. If you want to end up writing a story where people latch onto and relate to, then it's important to talk about stories that people have kind of a broad knowledge of. And additionally, America has clearly kind of dominated the American or the hip hop market since its inception. But I wanted to ask why this focus was made. Was it just kind of where you were at? Because there is some attention to global markets. There's a chapter on UMTV Raps, and you kind of talk about the British connection because it's relevant there. But it always feels tied to the story happening in America. Why the American lens?
Well, number one, you have to go to the origin. You can't talk about the blues and do, have sort of equal or anywhere near focus on Japan.
Sure.
Even though the blues has gone to Japan, where it came from was the Mississippi Delta. So, and I was very, very conscious, again, of not doing a survey. In other words, a lot of hip hop books have been structured almost geographically. Here's the scene in New York. Here's the scene in Los Angeles. Here's the scene in Houston. Oh, we can't forget Atlanta. What about Chicago? Like, that's it. I did not want to do that. That's not how a story is written. That is equanimity, sorry, for its own sake.
Yeah.
And I did not want to do that. What I was trying to write about were the important firsts and breakthroughs that created this business. And for the most part, all of them happened in America. I wasn't so concerned with how global it got, or rather, everything that happened globally came forth from something that happened in one of these stories. I think maybe if I had wanted to write a 1,000-page book, maybe I could have talked about Funk and Klein. You know, I always wanted to talk about Dave Klein, Funk and Klein, and his forays. You know, he was one of the first people to really advocate for rap acts globally, because he was a tour manager globally. So he went to Europe and he took the Jungle Brothers and De La Soul over to Europe for the first time. And he was all about, there was this group called Zimbabwe Legit that he was really into. But those stories in some ways for me were dead ends, because it's not like then, okay, Zimbabwe started churning out, you know, things that had global impact.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
So it was really about who were the characters, who were the innovators that created these, you know, these firsts. And, you know, as you said, in one case, yeah, you know what? The innovation did happen in London, because Sophie Bramley created the Yo Show in London and at MTV Europe. And I was not going to write about the birth of MTV Raps without going to Europe first.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes sense. And as you're reading the text as well, there's always, I guess as you say, there's almost no dead ends, right? So every chapter, every character that's introduced, they're relevant at some later point in the book. So if you end up reading the early chapter, you end up getting information on Russell Simmons, or Russell Simmons' character is introduced in the book. But throughout the text, his actions are relevant for later sections and later chapters. It does feel like this kind of building narrative that's been formed, and by the end, when you're reading the last chapters of the book, you have this kind of foundational background to lie on. It's not just, here's another story that's interesting. It's, here's a continuation of this story that's already been happening. And it feels grounded and kind of linear in that way.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, it's purposeful.
Yeah.
And, it takes a lot of work. You have to, you know, I'm working on a book on J-Dilla right now, the life and afterlife of J-Dilla. And it's just, you know, I'm having flashbacks to that process. You know, if you interview enough people, if you read enough around a subject, you start to see connections where people may have not connected things before.
Sure.
And people, you know, you get to see who's important, right? Who's important later on. You know, why am I talking about this guy, Brian Cross, who just goes to take pictures of Slum Village, you know, and the Far Side, and then later J-Dilla? You know, why is the photographer important? Because he's not just a photographer, right? Later on he becomes a filmmaker and a friend and somebody who helps to take the vision, you know, of the music of this person and put it in a completely different context.
Yeah.
You know, the context of orchestral music. That's huge. And so, you know, the reason we have so many pictures of J-Dilla and the iconic ones that we refer to is because Brian Cross took them. And the reason that we have this orchestral version of Dilla is because Brian Cross made that happen. So the characters through the reporting will reveal why they are important.
Yeah.
Bad Five Freddy was one of those. Like, oh, dude, you're everywhere. Like, you were important then, you're important now, and I don't think people understand how you're linked to all these things. And those are your through people. I mean, one of my great, sort of bittersweet, not even sweet, just bitter, things about this book is obviously Russell Simmons is the super meta through line in all of this.
Yeah.
And then, of course, through all of this, there was that other life that he led, that was pretty much well hidden from many of us who were close to him, that life of violence towards women.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that ends up being the most interesting kind of element of the book, right? So I think Fab Five Freddy is a perfect example, because if you're a fan of hip hop and you read about hip hop, you end up reading about different kind of elements of his career, right? You read about Yo MTV Raps. You'll read about the Blondie mention early on, right? You hear about these kind of sporadic events, but to see how they tie together and how the connections are made, I think that ends up being the most interesting kind of part, at least for myself, and I think for other people that are already vaguely familiar with a lot of these topics, right? Because I don't think anything in the book was completely new to me, and I don't think it's completely new to most people that are going to pick up a copy, but it's how the story is told in that narrative and how everything kind of ties together. I think that ends up being the most captivating element of the text.
Oh, well, thank you for saying it.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's why we write.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of people, listen, when you're writing a book like this, you're going to run into some folks who are like, I don't want to be interviewed because I'm going to write my own book.
Yes.
People do not understand what it takes to write and write well. And I'm not saying I'm the greatest writer in the world. I think what I do well is synthesis. It's hard to do that, right? But I happen to have a brain that works that way.
Sure.
Oh yeah, this person comes around here and this person goes in here and I can plug them in here and that's how we make a story.
Yeah. You make an argument in the book that this story is an important part of hip hop, not just in terms of marketing and promoting hip hop culture, but you make the argument that these things are a part of hip hop culture. You actually write in the opening that you believe marketing should be like hip hop's elusive fifth element. Why do you think this story, I guess, is important for those just interested in hip hop on a surface level? Because I think a lot of people are interested in hip hop, but they're tied to artist biographies. They're tied to the music and the art, and they'll memorize, Snoop Dogg released these albums in this order, and there was a demo released of this tape, or what have you. But the business end of things often doesn't feel necessary to understand hip hop as a whole. But the book seems to make the argument that it is. I just kind of wanted to ask, why?
Well, because it's true. I don't think that you can understand. It's not like Run DMC. Like, one of the sort of the old school, and when I say old school, I mean really old school, like the old school narratives about Run DMC is like, then Run DMC got big and commercial and they ruined everything. Like, Run DMC didn't just happen. It's not like Run and Joe put on some pork pie hats and some tracksuits and suddenly started selling bajillions of records. I mean, there was like, near failures and bankruptcies as a part of that whole tale. It didn't just happen. And one of the reasons it happens is that somebody invested in it, right? Somebody fought for them who you wouldn't think of as fighting for Run DMC. Some, white Jewish guy who, doesn't really necessarily have a relationship with rap culture at all, but saw in Run DMC something special and big and liked them and admired them and fought for them in his own way, right? And that the business is filled with that. I mean, one of the things I guess that prompted me was in 2005 when, I'd moved back to New York and Hot 97 was going through a really Hot 97 was the hip hop station in the big hip hop station in New York, or had become the big hip hop station. Because I remembered, of course, a time when Hot 97 wouldn't play any rap. They were anti-rap. just like a lot of the other stations in New York. And there was a big protest because there had just been a tsunami in Asia, and some idiot on the morning show created something called the Tsunami Song that was super racist towards Asians, and people were really up in arms, and they rightly blamed Hot 97 and its parent company, Emis, for this, this problem. But somehow that got conflated. I remember one of the protesters, I'm not going to say their name because they're pretty famous, but that protester was like, companies like Emis just glom onto hip hop, so they can make money. And I remembered being at Power 106 at Emis when Emis did not think they were dragged kicking and screaming into hip hop, right? Hip hop was not like, oh, let's just glom onto it and make money. I mean, people almost had to be convinced that you could make money in hip hop. And why was it important to convince them? Because there was no market, right? People are so happy for the success of De La Soul and Tribe Called Quest and, any of these sort of mid-90s, Cypress Hill, we love them, but radio sucks. Dude, if radio hadn't played this stuff, if MTV hadn't played this stuff, you wouldn't know who they are.
Yeah.
So, the business played a huge role in that. And that it wasn't just some form of co-optation along strict racial lines. It was in many ways a generational fight in which young black folks were allied with young white people and Asians and Latinos in sort of breaking open this older, generation.
Yeah.
And fighting them for market space. Now, once things become mainstream, then there's a whole other battle that takes place. But I teach students at NYU, New York University, and it's hard for them to conceive of a time when hip hop was ever on the margins. And that hip hop wasn't a place to, you can make money doing that, and so I just wanted to tell that story. I just wanted to give people the history so that they would know how hard people fought for this thing. And it didn't just happen, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I agree with you. I do think it's an important story, and I do think it's a part of the hip hop story as a whole. I think, to play devil's advocate, I think what a lot of people that are, I don't know, you label them whatever you want or whatever they want to be labeled, but let's say like hip hop purists, I think there's this hesitation to accept the commercialization of hip hop in any sort of way, right? That idea of hip hop, it started out in the park, we used to do it out in the dark, right? This idea that it was this grassroots community kind of endeavor, and it originated out of the pockets of commercialization, and it should remain that way to some degree. I think that's the sentiment that I think people have when they almost dismiss the commercialization of it, or if they're not going to dismiss it, they almost attribute all the negatives of hip hop to it, right? This is a bad story that we're telling. It's nothing good came from this. They may claim to like Cypress Hill or the Beastie Boys or what have you, but it wasn't worth the sacrifices that came from it. I guess I think is the idea, and I see that to some degree. I resonate with some of those ideas, but at the same time, I do think it's an important part of it. And it, regardless of what should have happened, it did happen, and that's it's ingrained in what hip hop has become. So therefore, it's a part of hip hop in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I don't know who's specifically making those arguments. I think it sounds very similar to the one that I told you about, when I was at that protest, just this sort of know-nothing attitude, oh yeah, we love Tribe Called Quest, but we hate that, dude, who do you think funded Tribe Called Quest? Who do you think made that happen, right? you know, you hate commercial hip hop, and you just are about hip hop as sort of like this street culture, and yet every single person in that street culture would have killed for an opportunity like this. So to me, it just feels disingenuous when I hear those arguments, and it's very, very hard for me to take them seriously, especially now having written this book partially in response to them. You know, this idea also, and this is not exclusive to hip hop, but it is sort of endemic in our arts culture, because we do not have an arts culture that is supported by the public at all, and it is completely in the realm of capitalism. This idea that record company people are shady, right? Q-Tip himself
4080, yeah.
And of course the irony of Tribe Called Quest situation is it wasn't the record company that screwed them. It was actually the middlemen that they themselves enrolled with, you know, that got in between them and the record company, that siphoned off half of the cash that they received for their advances and things like that. You know, Wendy Day in the book, you know, said that herself when she started the Rap Coalition to get rappers out of bad deals. You know, more often than not, it's the middlemen, not the corporations, who are the mercenaries in this, and who do not, and don't bring value in doing so.
Yeah.
Right? You have people who really, really love this business and have fought for it at every level, from artist to executive. And then you also have, in equal amount, mercenary artists and executives. So artists don't have a premium on purity. Yeah. That's what I mean by everybody gets to be human. Just because you're an artist doesn't mean you're a good person. Just because you're good at business or good at your art, doesn't mean that you, are an ethical person.
Yep.
And just because you do business doesn't mean you're not
ethical. Yeah.
You know, unethical.
You're not an
you know
asshole,
what I mean?
yeah.
So I just feel like, so I wanted people just to meet these folks instead of it being cliche. All of our writing is a battle against cliche. You know, even today, you know, what's one of the reasons that music journalism is just, a shell, is that people will write things like, well, the media, the industry, like, who the hell are you talking about? You're the media.
Yeah.
You're the industry. Who is doing these horrible things? Name them. And if you can't name them, shut up, right? Then you haven't done your work. That's what I'm saying. Do the work.
Fair enough. There's plenty of kind of interesting facets and stories that are told within the book, and obviously I can't get to all of them, but one of the kind of stories that stood out to me, probably one of the most, it was one of my favorite parts of the book, was the whole, early on, the story of Sylvia Robinson, Joe Robinson, and Sugar Hill Records, and the creation of Rapper's Delight, and that whole kind of story. And you've heard this time and time again, but there was something that kind of stood out to me here. That was the success of Rapper's Delight. And I never really thought about this before reading the book, but there really wasn't any predecessor for the record in order to seem familiar to the audience, right? Experimental records generally don't do very well, but Rapper's Delight is the exception. It does extremely well, and it's really kind of seen as the first. You may be able to have a couple records here or there that might have predated it, but it's not... to the masses, this was the first record that they heard that would have identified with hip-hop, and it did extremely well, despite it being a rather experimental record. Why do you think that Rapper's Delight did this well? Because it seems that right from the very beginning, hip-hop was almost primed for the masses. It seemed that there's something innate about hip-hop, or the sound of hip-hop, or maybe just the sound of Rapper's Delight, but there's something about hip-hop that speaks to the masses in kind of a fundamental way, it feels like, at least to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, the thing about Rapper's Delight is it was half experimental and half pop, because it was recorded over one of the most popular pop songs of that summer. So it was Chic's good times, but with some experimental stuff happening on top of it.
Yeah.
So it's the perfect vehicle for that experimentation. But also, as much as people slag Sylvia Robinson and, say, oh man, those guys in Sugar Hill Gang, they weren't real rappers. They didn't come from anywhere. Like, how brilliant is Wonder Mike's first verse? How brilliant is it, right? First of all, he uses the famous ad-lib that then becomes the name of the entire genre. Then he says, what you hear is not a test, right? Which is the typical when we were all watching TV in the 70s and 80s, this is not a test, So he's saying you are about to hear something experimental, right? He's explaining to you what you're about to hear. I'm rapping to the beat, right? And me, the groove, and my friends are going to try to move your feet, right? Then he introduces himself. Another brilliant thing. I am Wonder Mike, and I'd like to say hello. And who's going to be the audience for all this shit, right? The black, the brown, the red, and the purple, and yellow, right? So, to me, what's more brilliant in terms of the songwriting than that? It's also perfectly, and, that is actually one question I'd really like to ask him, as a lyricist. Like, how the hell did you think of that? That was brilliant. Imagine if it wasn't that.
Yeah, there's this DIY element in hip-hop that I think most often ends up getting associated with hip-hop's kind of underground communities. So let it be Mystic Journeyman and Project Blowed to the Chopped and Screwed kind of mixtape movement that happened in the South. That said, what was surprising to me when reading this text was it seems that this same mentality was shared across hip-hop's kind of elite. People like Sylvia Robinson, Rick Rubin, Steve Plotnicki, they seem to share the same sort of mentality in terms of like a DIY, do-it-yourself mentality, but simply had more resources to call on. Was that a realization that you ended up coming across yourself when going through this? Because I mostly study underground hip-hop communities, and I kind of get tethered to this idea of DIY, but to see it practiced in this way on such a kind of a high-end level and not really this kind of grassroots level is really, really interesting to me.
Well, I mean, look, as far as like hip-hop culture, that was completely DIY. Whenever something starts to get recorded, then you have varying levels of complexity. Sylvia Robinson, that was a key person to make one of these very first recordings, because she was an incredible producer and she had facilities, right? Rick Rubin didn't necessarily have them, but Rick Rubin also was a fan of hardcore. And that was where the term DIY came from, right? The zines and the clubs and the flyers and, people making, 7-inch records and selling them, by hand. That was a huge part of the hardcore thing. And there was a lot of alliance between hardcore and hip hop in, early 1980s New York. So it was nothing for Rick to think about running a business out of his dorm and putting up 12 inches and things like that. And the meta story of the DIY is, well, nobody wanted to fuck hip hop. Major labels didn't want to sign it. Radio stations didn't want to play it. So you have to make your own records if you want to make records. And if the radio stations don't want to play them, you have to start your own radio shows on community stations like they did at WHBI. You have to rent time,
I love the story that's told in the...
obviously...
I love the story in the book that's told where the dude was a fan of like Billboard successes and whatnot, so he ended up writing down like all the names of these records, and then when he owned a record store, I think it was the same dude, but when he owned the record store, he would end up writing down the names of all the records that the kids were coming in for and looking for these breaks, and then ended up making the break compilations. So those early break compilations were started because of that. I thought it was just such an ingenious way of
Right.
kind of stumbling on that idea. I know these break compilations exist, but I had no idea the origins of it, right? I think that's kind of a prime example. But yeah, there's so many different stories of this same sort of mentality displayed throughout the book.
Yeah, but even like later on, right, with Power and Beware, with Dame Dash and Rockaware. I mean, people don't think of it that way, but Rockaware was a DIY company. I mean, obviously they had resources. They had people, they had people in the rag trade, garment trade that they could talk to. But still, man, there's no guarantee of success. And the whole reason that Rockaware exists is that existing brands did not want to mess with Jay and those people. And that is the ethos of hip hop. That's why I say, it's the fifth element of hip hop, which is, it's just a label. It's just a title. But what I'm trying to say when I say that is just that it is integral to the culture. The hustle is integral to the culture, a particular kind of hustle. And that is to be applauded and valued as much as being able to rock a mic, because we wouldn't know about any of this stuff. You and I would not be sitting here talking about this stuff today had it not been for Corey Robin, Steve Plotnicki, Leor Cohen, Keith Naftali, Sophie Bramley, Fab Five Freddy, right? People who, are the most unlikely folks. They may not have incredible facility with black culture. They may not know the difference between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington and don't care.
Sure.
Some of them do, some don't. But the fact of the matter is they did the work for whatever their motivations. They did the work to make this thing happen so that everybody could eat. And eating is a big part of it too. People want to act like, it's not important to eat, not important to create situations where people can make a living off of doing what they're doing. And it is important. And so important that it's it's one of the prime lyrical obsessions of hip hop.
Yeah, fair enough.
Make money. Oh yeah, the culture. Like, you know what? Just please. That's to me. I was just,
There's that,
and it's funny, I haven't really thought like this in a while. Just talking to you about the book, obviously being 10 years old, brings up all of these emotions, frustrations, like, oh my God, how could you not see this?
Yeah.
Right? For me.
There's that lyric, I think it's from Plug One, De La Soul, off of that first Serve album that dropped a few years ago, where he says, I do it for the love. Yeah, the love of money. And it's a factor. It can't not be a factor.
Yeah, but also you should be paid for what you do well.
I agree.
There's no shame in that.
I agree. The book ends up ending with this cliff note on the election of Barack Obama, and kind of suggesting that Obama is really the first hip-hop president. But Obama's presidency aside, do you think hip-hop has changed America in any fundamental way?
Well, that, of course, is, at the end of sort of 10 years, even very quickly after the Big Payback made its way out into the world, I began to feel like my own attitudes toward culture and its power to change the rest of society were overblown. And I think the moment for me happened when it wasn't Tamir Rice. It was, I think it was, oh man, hold on, I'm having a senior moment here.
Trayvon?
Yeah, you know what it was? It was when Trayvon Martin was shot.
Gotcha.
It was when Trayvon Martin was shot, and I was about to appear on a panel at South by Southwest with Steve Stout, who had just put out his book, The Tanning of America. It's very optimistic, businessman's take on culture's ability to bring everybody together. And I felt instinctively that I didn't know we were heading into a darker time, I still was generally optimistic, but I began to feel like, culture, and I think also because I was working at a website, like editing websites and sort of seeing what was happening to media business as well. I just began to think, hip hop culture for a lot of us in the 80s and 90s was our life, and it colored everything we did. It, for white kids like me, even though I had, obviously, I was already an African American studies major before hip hop really became, huge, but I know that Public Enemy, people listening to Public Enemy, the folks who had never picked up the autobiography of Malcolm X before, so they're reading that. It is changing some people. It's hugely meaningful. But then there's a whole other segment of the population that treats culture like it's a bag of Doritos. You eat it and you throw it away. And I started to realize that just because Kendrick is political, doesn't mean that every Kendrick fan, white or black or Latino or Asian, is going to metabolize that in the same way. And so I started to feel that way, like, okay, the great work that's being done to change the society is being done by these kids in the street protesting in Ferguson. And then more recently, after the murder of George Floyd, the people who are really changing society aren't the rappers, they aren't the MCs, aren't the producers, isn't Jay-Z with his great companies, right? It is folks in the street demanding change. And that ultimately is where these battles have to be fought. Sure. And then the other part of it, of course, is I used Obama as a through line in the book, right? It was Alexander Hamilton and Obama. By the way, well before Hamilton, well before the play Hamilton. So there was, this sort of through line with Obama that is very optimistic, right? But I forgot the other character who is even more of a fixture in hip hop than Obama ever was. And that was Donald Trump. Doesn't even get a mention in the book.
Yeah, fair enough.
And frankly, more rappers interacted with Trump, wanted to be Trump, talked about Trump than ever for Barack Obama. So that's, and that would help people understand the mercenary part of hip hop that won, right? The misogynist part of hip hop that won. And when you think about it also, who's the person who blurbed Russell Simmons' book? Who got the lead blurb for his book, Life and Death?
Trump?
Donald Trump. So for me, that was, in looking back in 10 years with hindsight, that was the blind spot of the book. It's optimism. And, if it becomes a documentary project at some point, I think that I would probably add that layer and that nuance to it, as we continue the story. But yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating, the connection with Trump. I can name offhand quite a few different examples of just praise and association that hip-hop had with Donald Trump before his presidency, and then kind of the 180 that ended up happening after his presidency. It's an amazing story. There must be a book somewhere in there in order to write. I wanted to ask here, kind of the last question on the Big Payback, but do you think releasing a book like the Big Payback restricts access to the business down the road? I ask this because I know your own history is kind of part of this story, and part of me thinks that deciding to write this means accepting that you're going to end up inevitably burning some bridges. Was that something that you contemplated before writing and before dedicating yourself to this project? And I guess on a more kind of interesting note, do you think it's happened?
No, not at all. I mean, I number one, I didn't think about this as, I didn't have any conceit that I wanted to be a part of the music business ever again. So it wasn't really a concern for me in that way. It actually created more bridges than it burned. I mean, I don't think it burned really any bridges for me. There was the only people who complained about the Big Payback were the people who got left out for whatever reason, either by complete accident or, you know, just not because they're just not, you know, what I consider to be a vital part of the narrative. But that was very, very uncommon. And for the most part, I think people respected the book and people in the industry respected the book. There was no like gotchas in here for the most part for folks. Yeah. So no, that was never a concern for me. And this book wasn't a mercenary endeavor for me. This was a labor of like, this is, you know, and that's the problem with writing books is that if they become too much a labor of love, then, you know, you put yourself in some unfair positions, in terms of, you know, how much you're willing to work without pay.
Yeah, fair enough. I wanted to cap this conversation off, if you have a few more moments, just to talk about the J-Dilla book that's coming out. It's not out yet, and therefore I haven't had a chance to read it because of that. But for those listening at home, and for me, what was really the goal of this J-Dilla book? Because we've gotten coverage before, but what kind of separates... and we've gotten amazing coverage before. Like I'm thinking of like the Crate Diggers documentary on J Dilla, or just the numerous interviews and whatnot that have been done. How is this book going to be different than the story that's already been told on JD?
Well, first of all, there's only one book that has ever been written about J Dilla, and that is Jordan Ferguson. If your fellow countryman, Jordan Ferguson's great book on donuts. And it's a small book. It contains a great bit of his story. And I think Jordan did an amazing job, on his discourse about that album. I am telling a different story. I'm not telling the story about an album. I am telling the story of why this person is one of the most important people in popular music, period, in the last 100 years. And that is because J Dilla essentially invented a third way of relating to musical time and is essentially the only person from electronic music to change the way that musicians think about time and think about processing rhythm on their instruments. And also changed electronic music as well and the way we think about rhythm. And the fact is that nobody's talking about that. At least nobody's talking about it in ways that are accurate, in ways that make musical sense, in ways that have clear language. People have sort of danced around this idea. They say, oh, you know, he's got that great feeling, that great swing, that great bounce, whatever. You know, he doesn't quantize stuff like that. And that's just all wrong. It's like trying to describe a three-dimensional object using only the language of two dimensions. That is what describing J Dilla's, music as swing or as non-quantized. That's what it's like to me.
Sure.
And at a certain point, it became like nails on a chalkboard, especially since I was teaching a class on Dilla. And so finally, it was another one of these moments like that, you know, that time at the protest strike that I told you about for the Big Payback in 2005. It's like, you know what? Fuck it. I have to write this damn thing. So that's what I've done. So it's called Dilla Time, how a hip hop producer reinvented rhythm and changed the way musicians play.
I spoke to Kathy Iandoli recently, semi-recently anyways, within the last few months, and she just ended up writing her God Save the Queen's book. And she's writing a biopic on Aaliyah, which should be released at some point this year, I believe. She had, in my conversation anyway, she ended up kind of revealing that she had to decide what story that she wanted to tell with the Aaliyah book. And ultimately, she said that her story kind of focuses as much on Aaliyah's life as it does on her legacy and what her life meant to others. So where does the Dilla Book
Mhm.
kind of lie in this conversation? Is it the story of Slum Village and Frank and Dank and the Tribe Called Quest, or is it a story of what Dilla kind of meant for hip hop after the fact?
The answer is yes. It's
It's
all of that.
both. Man, I'm really excited to read the Dilla book. I'm a J Dilla fan myself. I don't want to like I know there's like real like diehard J Dilla fans, and maybe I'm not quite in that category, but I've always found his life really interesting, and I've loved a lot of the music that he's put out. And I'm a sucker for just stories and being able to kind of just learn more about different characters in hip hop. I think I think you're an excellent writer. I think the Big Payback ends up proving that. But I think if you have some sort of connection to this story, I think you're the right person to tell it in a lot of ways. I'm excited for this book. I'd love to have you back on when it does end up coming out and when I get a chance to read it.
Well, dude, I mean, that's incredibly sweet of you. Again, writing can be a very lonely thing, so it's always nice to hear when people resonate with it. As you can tell, I write because I'm passionate about the stuff. I'm not shy about my opinions. And I think, maybe the Dilla book will ruffle some feathers too, because I think that I'm going to be talking about him in ways that, I say early on in the book, this is not a product of the Church of Dilla. He is a complicated dude, but he's also a genius. And a genius in ways that people don't even really understand that he's a genius. Like we intuitively understand it, but we don't always have the language for it. Like, Timothy M. Burnside knew that Dilla's MPC belonged in the Smithsonian next to George Clinton's mothership and Chuck Berry's Cadillac,
Yeah.
right? But she didn't necessarily have the language for why. What I'm trying to do with the book is give people the language. Here's the music. Here's the science behind it. Here's what it means. And then, his life story, which I've tried to do as best I can. It's been about 150 interviews over the course of the last 3 years.
Wow, I didn't expect the interview kind of the size or body of interviews that you've collected to be that large for this project. I would have expected that for the Big Payback, and I've done hundreds of interviews. I'm writing a book on the Canadian hip hop scene and the history of Canadian hip hop, and
Wow.
In doing so, I think I have my interview folder up here, but I think it's like 580 or so. But it's a story that needs a lot of interviews.
So
right? You need to do that hard work and that process in order to gather this information, because it's not really readily available elsewhere. But I would think that you'd almost be able to write the Dilla story.
Well, especially if they're not on planet Earth.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah,
and that's troubling with a lot of aspects of what I write about, right? Like if I want to write about like Cool Kurt was a DJ in Saskatoon, a very pioneering and important DJ in the community, and opened up a lot of doors for other artists. But he also passed away a number of years ago, as of now. And there's numerous characters like that within the book. But just being able to tell their story and having to build a narrative that doesn't exist anywhere, right? There's no real, unless you interview people and you talk to people about their kind of early experiences being introduced to hip hop in Saskatoon, those are the times that you end up getting the name Cool Kurt mentioned. He doesn't have any editorials written about him. There's no interviews from his life. There's nothing that exists. But so you have to end up doing the hard work, and it was interviewing his family members, his cousins, that kind of thing, his nephews, people that heard his show, his partner, his DJ partner, radio show kind of personnel, and people that were like managing the radio station itself that he was a part of, and it's trying to build that story that way. But it's in Dilla's case, it almost seems easier, right? There's so much, there's an abundance of content on Dilla. There's an abundance of interviews, and anyone that ever had an association with Dilla, when they're interviewed today, they're going to be asked about Dilla, right? It seems like it should be easier. I'm frankly, I'm surprised that you ended up doing that much kind of groundwork, and I'm really excited for it now.
Because the the seeming easier is deceptive.
Sure.
Because if you begin to read widely on Dilla, you understand that people are actually contradicting each other. A lot of these common narratives, especially around donuts, like, the idea that he created it in the hospital, Boss 404.
People would bring him samples.
Right? Just like,
yeah, I've heard those stories.
It's just not, I understand why people feel that way, but and there's a lot of disinfo out there. So, and I'm not saying I'm looking for disinfo or looking to discredit anybody. I'm just saying, listen, if you interview one person, you get one story. If you interview 3 people or 5 people about the same thing, you start to understand what's real and what's not.
That's fair. Well, I first heard about the book just through our email correspondence.
When is your book coming out?
I put in the research ethics board here at the university because it's resourced through our university at Cape Breton University here in Nova Scotia. I put in for June of 2022, and I could always extend it, but in my mind that's still been my due date for when the research portion has to be done, and when I frankly I want to get the writing done by that point as well. It's been a few years in the process, and a lot of it's written. A lot of the interviews are already completed, of course, but there's still a lot to do. To answer your question, I don't know.
I strongly recommend you writing. Yeah, no, but I strongly recommend you start writing ASAP, because it's the writing that actually tells you what reporting still needs to be done.
Yeah, I've written.
It's only in knowing what you don't have.
I've written a couple of the major chapters, so I'm in that process anyhow, but still a lot of work needs to be done on the project.
Great. Well, I would love to read it when you're done.
100%. I can definitely make sure that happens. But yeah, I first heard about the Dilla project when you ended up telling me through email, and ever since you ended up telling me, it's been high on my list of just books that I'm really excited for to read, and I'll definitely be pre-ordering a copy whenever the pre-order link is available for it. But again, I'd love to have you back on whenever that book does come out so we can kind of talk about it and break it down. But for this conversation, thank you. It's been a blast. The Big Payback is one of my favorite books on hip-hop, period. I said that at the beginning of the call, but it really is. And from everyone that I've spoken to that has read it, they kind of equally praise the project. I think it's a really important book, and I'm glad to have you on the podcast to talk about it. So thank you.
Oh, man. Thank you. You're why I wrote it.
That's great to hear.
You're why I wrote it. So thank you.